Topic 4.4 America on the World Stage. The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and charter which the Revolution had given, and which were daily lessened. I hope the permanency of the Union is thereby better secured. Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, 1816. Learning objective. Explain how and why American foreign policy developed over time. From their founding as the colonies to their fight for independence, the United States was strongly influenced by the actions of other nations. Even President Washington had to deal with foreign entanglements. See Topic 3.10, likely leading to his warning against permanent alliances in foreign affairs. Jefferson's foreign policy. President Jefferson brought considerable experience in dealing with foreign affairs. He had served as a foreign minister in Europe and Secretary of the State prior to his election in 1800. This experience led to success with the Louisiana Purchase, but would be challenged by numerous other foreign affair questions. Difficulties abroad. As a matter of policy and principle, Jefferson tried to avoid war. Rejecting permanent alliances, he sought to maintain U.S. neutrality despite increasing provocation from both France and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Barbary pirates. The first major challenge to Jefferson's foreign policy came not from a major European power, but from a piracy practiced by the Barbary states on the North African coast. To protect U.S. merchant ships from being seized by Barbary pirates, Presidents Washington and Adams had reluctantly agreed to pay tributes to the Barbary government. The ruler of Tripoli demanded a higher sum in tribute from Jefferson. Refusing to pay, Jefferson sent a small fleet of the U.S. Navy to the Mediterranean. Sporadic fighting with the Tripoli lasted for 4 years, 1801 to 1805. Although the American Navy did not achieve a decisive victory, it did gain some respect and offered a measure of protection to U.S. vessels trading in the Mediterranean waters. Challenges to U.S. neutrality. Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars continued to dominate the politics of Europe and to shape the commercial economy of the United States. The two principal belligerents, France and Britain, attempted naval blockades of enemy ports. They regularly seized the ships of neutral nations and confiscated their cargoes. The chief offender from the U.S. point of view was Britain, since its navy dominated the Atlantic. Most infuriating was the British practice of capturing U.S. sailors who it claimed were British citizens and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. Chesapeake Leopard Affair. One incident at sea especially aroused American anger and almost led to war. In 1807, only a few miles off the coast of Virginia, the British warship Leopard fired on the U.S. warship Chesapeake. 3 Americans were killed, and 4 others were taken captive and impressed into the British Navy. Anti-British feeling ran high, and many Americans demanded war. Jefferson, however, resorted to diplomacy and economic pressure as his response to the crisis. Embargo Act, 1807. As an alternative to war, Jefferson persuaded the Democratic-Republican majority in Congress to pass the Embargo Act in 1807. This measure prohibited American merchant ships from sailing to any foreign port. Since the United States was Britain's largest trading partner, Jefferson hoped that the British would stop violating the rights of neutral nations rather than lose U.S. trade. The embargo, however, backfired and brought greater economic hardship to the United States than to Britain. The British were determined to control the seas at all costs, and they had little difficulty substituting supplies from South America for U.S. goods. The embargo's effect on the U.S. economy, however, was devastating, especially for the merchant marine and shipbuilders of New England. So bad was the depression that a movement developed in the New England states to secede from the Union. Recognizing that the Embargo Act had failed, Jefferson called for its repeal in 1809 during the final days of his presidency. Even after repeal, however, U.S. ships could trade legally with all nations except Britain and France. President Madison's foreign policy. Madison's presidency was dominated by the same European problems that had plagued Jefferson's second term. Commercial warfare. Like Jefferson, Madison attempted a combination of diplomacy and economic pressure to deal with the Napoleonic Wars. Unlike Jefferson, he finally consented to take the United States to war. Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. After the repeal of Jefferson's disastrous Embargo Act, Madison hoped to end economic hardship while maintaining his country's rights as a neutral nation. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 provided that Americans could now trade with all nations except Britain and France. Macon's Bill No. 2, 1810. Economic hardships continued into 1810. Nathaniel Macon, a member of Congress, introduced a bill that restored U.S. trade with Britain and France. Macon's Bill No. 2 provided, however, that if either Britain or France formally agreed to respect U.S. neutral rights at sea, then the United States would prohibit trade with that nation's foe. Napoleon's deception. Upon hearing of Congress's action, Napoleon announced his intention of revoking the decree that had violated U.S. neutral rights. Taking Napoleon at his words, Madison carried out the terms of Macon's Bill No. 2 by embargoing U.S. trade with Britain in 1811. However, he soon realized that Napoleon had no intention of fulfilling his promise. The French continued to seize American merchant ships. The War of 1812. Neither Britain nor the United States wanted their dispute to end in war, and yet war between them did break out in 1812. Cause of the war. From the U.S. point of view, the pressures leading to war came from two directions: the continued violation of U.S. neutral rights at sea and troubles with the British on the western frontier. Free seas and trade. As a trading nation, the United States depended upon the free flow of shipping across the Atlantic. Yet the chief belligerents in Europe, Britain and France, had no interest in respecting neutral rights so long as they were locked in a life-and-death struggle with one another. They well remembered that Britain had seemed a cruel enemy during the American Revolution, and the French had supported the colonists. In addition, Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans applauded the French for having overthrown their monarchy in their own revolution. Moreover, even though both the French and the British violated U.S. neutral rights, the British violations were worse because of British Navy practice of impressing American sailors. Frontier pressures. Added to long-standing grievances over British actions at sea were the ambitions of the Western Americans for more land. Americans on the frontier longed for lands of British Canada and Spanish Florida. Standing in the way were the British and their Indian and Spanish allies. Conflict with the American Indians was a perennial problem for the restless Westerners. For decades, settlers had been gradually pushing the American Indians farther and farther westward. In an effort to defend their lands from further encroachment, Shawnee brothers, a warrior named Tecumseh, and a religious leader known as the Prophet, attempted to unite all of the tribes east of the Mississippi River. White settlers became suspicious of Tecumseh and persuaded the governor of the Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, to take aggressive action. In the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, Harrison destroyed the Shawnee headquarters, which ended Tecumseh's effort to form an Indian confederacy. The British had provided only a little aid to Tecumseh. Nevertheless, Americans on the frontier blamed the British for instigating the rebellion. War hawks. A congressional election in 1810 had brought a group of new, young Democratic Republicans to Congress, many of them from frontier states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Known as war hawks because of their eagerness for war with Britain, they quickly gained significant influence in the House of Representatives. Led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the War Hawks members of the Congress argued that war with Britain would be the only way to defend American honor, gain Canada, and destroy American Indian resistance on the frontier. Declaration of War. British delays in meeting U.S. demands over neutral rights, combined with political pressures from the War Hawks, finally persuaded Madison to seek a declaration of war against Britain. Ironically, the British government had by this time, June 1812, agreed to suspend its naval blockade. News of its decision reached the White House after Congress had declared war. A divided nation. Neither Congress nor the American people were united in support of the war. In Congress, Pennsylvania and Vermont joined the southern and western states to provide a slight majority for the war declaration. Voting against the war were most representatives from New York, New Jersey, and New England. Election of 1812. A similar division of opinion was seen in the presidential election of 1812, in which the Democratic-Republican strength in the South and West overcame Federalist and anti-war Democratic-Republican opposition to the war in the North. Madison won re-election, defeating DeWitt Clinton of New York, the candidate of the Federalists and anti-war Democratic Republicans. Opposition to the war. Americans who opposed the war viewed it as Mr. Madison's war and the work of the war hawks in Congress. Most outspoken in their criticism of the war were New England merchants, Federalist politicians, and Quids, or old Democratic Republicans. New England merchants were opposed because, after the repeal of the Embargo Act, they were making sizable profits from the European War and viewed impressment as merely a minor inconvenience. Both commercial interests and religious ties to Protestantism made them more sympathetic to the Protestant British than to the Catholic French. Federalist politicians viewed the war as a Democratic-Republican scheme to conquer Canada and Florida, with the ultimate aim of increasing Democratic-Republican voting strength. For their part, the Quids criticized the war because it violated the classic Democratic-Republican commitment to limited federal power and to the maintenance of peace. Military defeats and naval victories. Facing Britain's overwhelming naval power, Madison's military strategists based their hope for victory on 1. Napoleon's continued success in Europe, and 2. A U.S. land campaign against Canada. Invasion of Canada. A poorly equipped American army initiated military action in 1812 by launching a three-part invasion of Canada, one force starting out from Detroit, another from Niagara, and a third from Lake Champlain. These and later forays into Canada were easily repulsed by the British defenders. An American raid and burning of government buildings in York, Toronto in 1813 only served to encourage retaliation by the British. Naval battles. The U.S. Navy achieved some notable victories due largely to superior shipbuilding and the valorous deeds of American sailors, including many free African Americans. In late 1812, the U.S. warship Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, raised American morale by defeating and sinking a British ship off the coast of Nova Scotia. American privateers, motivated by both patriotism and profit, captured numerous British merchant ships. Offsetting these gains was the success of the British Navy in establishing a blockade of the U.S. coast, which crippled trading and fishing. Probably the most important naval battle of the war was in 1813 on Lake Erie with American Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, declaring victory with "We have met the enemy and they are ours." This led the way for General William Henry Harrison's victory at the Battle of the Thames, near Detroit, in which Tecumseh was killed. The next year, 1814, ships commanded by Thomas Macdonald defeated a British fleet on Lake Champlain. As a result, the British had to retreat and abandon their plan to invade New York and New England. Chesapeake Campaign. By the spring of 1814, the defeat of Napoleon in Europe enabled the British to increase their forces in North America. In the summer of that year, a British army marched through the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and set fire to the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings. The British also attempted to take Baltimore, but Fort McHenry held out after a night's bombardment, an event immortalized by Francis Scott Key in the words of the Star-Spangled Banner. Southern Campaign. Meanwhile, U.S. troops in the South were ably commanded by General Andrew Jackson. In March 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in present-day Alabama, Jackson ended the power of an important British ally, the Creek Nation. The victory eliminated the Indians and opened new lands to the white settlers. A British effort to control the Mississippi River was halted at New Orleans by Jackson leading a force of frontier soldiers, free African Americans, and Creoles. The victory was impressive, but also meaningless. The Battle of New Orleans was fought on January 8, 1815, 2 weeks after a treaty ending the war had been signed in Ghent, Belgium, but before news of the treaty had reached the military forces. The Treaty of Ghent. By 1814, the British were weary of war. Having fought Napoleon for more than a decade, they now faced the prospect of maintaining the peace in Europe. At the same time, Madison's government recognized that the Americans would be unable to win a decisive victory. American peace commissioners traveled to Ghent, Belgium, to discuss terms of peace with British diplomats. On Christmas Eve 1814, an agreement was reached. The terms halted fighting, returned all conquered territory to the pre-war claimant, and recognized the pre-war boundary between Canada and the United States. The Treaty of Ghent, promptly ratified by the Senate in 1815, said nothing at all about the grievances that led to war. Britain made no concession concerning impressment, blockades, or other maritime differences. Thus, the war ended in stalemate with no gain for either side. The Hartford Convention. Just before the war ended, the New England states threatened to secede from the Union. Bitterly opposed to both the war and a Democratic-Republican government in Washington, radical Federalists in New England urged that the Constitution be amended and that, as a last resort, secession be voted upon. To consider these matters, a special convention was held at Hartford, Connecticut in December 1814. Delegates from New England states rejected the radical calls for secession. But to limit the growing power of the Democratic Republicans in the South and West, they adopted a number of proposals. One of them called for a 2/3 vote of both houses for any future declaration of war. Shortly after the convention dissolved, news came of both Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent. These events ended criticism of the war and further weakened the Federalists by stamping them as unpatriotic. The war's legacy. From Madison's point of view, the war achieved none of its original aims. Nevertheless, it had a number of important consequences for the future development of the American Republic, including the following. 1. Having survived 2 wars with Britain, the United States gained the respect of other nations. 2. The United States accepted Canada as part of the British Empire. 3. Denounced for its talk of secession, the Federalist Party came to an end as a national force and declined even in New England. 4. Talk of nullification and secession in New England set a precedent that would later be used by the South. 5. Abandoned by the British, American Indians were forced to surrender land to white settlement. 6. With the British naval blockade limiting European goods, U.S. factories were built and Americans moved toward industrial self-sufficiency. 4. War heroes such as Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison would soon be in the forefront of a new generation of political leaders. 8. The feeling of nationalism grew stronger, as did a belief that the future for the United States lay in the West and away from Europe. Monroe and Foreign Affairs. Following the War of 1812, the United States adopted a more aggressive, nationalistic approach in its relations with other nations. During Madison's presidency, when problems with the Barbary pirates again developed, a fleet under Stephen Decatur was sent in 1815 to force the rulers of North Africa to allow American shipping the free use of the Mediterranean. President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams continued to follow a nationalistic policy that actively advanced American interests while maintaining peace. Canada. Although the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 had ended the war between Britain and the United States, it left unresolved most of their diplomatic differences, including many involving Canada. Rush-Bagot Agreement, 1817. During Monroe's first year as president, British and American negotiators agreed to a major disarmament pact. The Rush-Bagot Agreement strictly limited naval armament on the Great Lakes. In time, the agreement was extended to place limits on border fortifications as well. Ultimately, the border between the United States and Canada was to become the longest unfortified border in the world. Treaty of 1818. Improved relations between the United States and Britain continued in a treaty that provided for 1. Shared fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. 2. Joint occupation of the Oregon Territory for 10 years. And 3. The setting of the northern limits of the Louisiana Territory at the 49th parallel, thus establishing the western U.S.-Canada boundary line. Florida. During the War of 1812, U.S. troops had occupied western Florida, a strip of land on the Gulf of Mexico extending all the way to the Mississippi Delta. Previously, this land had been held by Spain, Britain's ally. After the war, Spain had difficulty governing the rest of Florida, the peninsula itself, because its troops had been removed from Florida to battle revolts in the South American colonies. The chaotic conditions permitted groups of Seminoles, runaway slaves, and white outlaws to conduct raids into U.S. territory and retreat to safety across the Florida border. These disorders gave Monroe and General Andrew Jackson an opportunity to take military action in Spanish Florida, a territory long coveted by American expansionists. Jackson's military campaign. In late 1817, the President commissioned General Jackson to stop the raiders and, if necessary, pursue them across the border into Spanish West Florida. Jackson carried out his orders with a vengeance and probably went beyond his instructions. In 1818, he led a force of militia into Florida, destroyed Seminole villages, and hanged 2 Seminole chiefs. Capturing Pensacola, Jackson drove out the Spanish governor and hanged 2 British traders accused of aiding the Seminoles. Many members of Congress feared that Jackson's overzealousness would precipitate a war with both Spain and Britain. However, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams persuaded Monroe to support Jackson, and the British decided not to intervene. Florida Purchase Treaty, 1819. Spain, worried that the United States would seize Florida and preoccupied with troubles in Latin America, decided to get the best possible terms for Florida. By treaty in 1819, Spain turned over all of its possessions in Florida and its own claims in Oregon Territory to the United States. In the exchange, the United States agreed to assume $5 million in claims against Spain and give up any U.S. territorial claims to the Spanish province of Texas. The agreement is also called the Adams-Onis Treaty. The Monroe Doctrine. Although focused on its own growth, the United States did not ignore the ambitions of Europe in the Western Hemisphere. The restoration of a number of monarchies in Europe after the fall of Napoleon in 1815 produced a backlash against republican movements. Restored monarchies in France, Austria, and Prussia, together with Russia, worked together to suppress liberal elements in Italy and Spain. They also considered helping Spain to return to power in South America, where a number of republics had recently declared their independence. In addition, Russia's presence in Alaska worried both Britain and the United States. Using their trading posts in Alaska as a base, Russian seal hunters had spread southward and established a trading post at San Francisco Bay. British and U.S. leaders decided they had a common interest in protecting North and South America from possible aggression by European power. British Initiative. British naval power deterred the Spanish from attempting a comeback in Latin America, but to maintain British trade with the Latin American republics required diplomacy. British Foreign Secretary George Cannon proposed to Richard Rush, the U.S. minister in London, a joint Anglo-American warning to the European powers not to intervene in South America. American response. Monroe and most of his advisors thought Cannon's idea of a joint declaration made sense. However, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams disagreed. He believed that joint action with Britain would restrict U.S. opportunities for further expansion in the hemisphere. Adams reasoned as follows. 1. If the United States acted alone, Britain could be counted upon to stand behind the U.S. policy. 2. No European power would risk going to war in South America, and if it did, the British Navy would surely defeat the aggressor. President Monroe decided to act as Adams advised, to issue a statement to the world that did not have Britain as a co-author. The Doctrine. On December 2, 1823, President Monroe inserted into his annual message to Congress a declaration of U.S. policy toward Europe and Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, as it came to be called, asserted as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and the independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Monroe declared further that the United States opposed attempts by a European power to interfere in the affairs of any republic in the Western Hemisphere. Impact. Monroe's bold words of nationalistic purpose were applauded by the American public, but were soon forgotten, as most citizens were more concerned with domestic issues. In Britain, Cannon was annoyed by the doctrine because he recognized that it applied not just to the other European powers, but to his country as well. The British, too, were warned not to intervene and not to seek new territory in the Western Hemisphere. The European monarchs reacted angrily to Monroe's message. Still, they recognized that their purposes were thwarted not by his words, but by the might of the British Navy. The Monroe Doctrine had less significance at the time than in later decades, when it would be hailed by politicians and citizens alike as the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America. In the 1840s, President James Polk was the first of many presidents to justify his foreign policy by referring to Monroe's warning words. Key terms by theme. Support. War hawks. Henry Clay. John C. Calhoun. Opposition. Quids. Hartford Convention, 1814. The West. Tecumseh. Prophet. William Henry Harrison. Battle of Tippecanoe. War. Napoleon Bonaparte. Barbary pirates. Neutrality. Impressment. Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Embargo Act, 1807. James Madison. Non-Intercourse Act, 1809. Macon's Bill No. 2, 1810. War of 1812. Old Ironsides. Battle of Lake Erie. Oliver Hazard Perry. Battle of the Thames. Thomas MacDonald. Battle of Lake Champlain. Andrew Jackson. Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Creek Nation. Battle of New Orleans. Treaty of Ghent, 1814. Foreign Affairs. Stephen Decatur. Rush-Bagot Agreement, 1817. Treaty of 1818. Andrew Jackson. Florida Purchase Treaty, 1819. Monroe Doctrine, 1823. The Anthem. Francis Scott Key. The Star-Spangled Banner,